My name is Brian Muraresku. So this is the Immortality Key, the secret history of the religion with no name. Believe it or not, it took me about 12 years to research and write this book. And I'd like to share with you what that key is. And there's a reason that the title of this talk is How to Die Before You Die, because as I found it through the course of my research, this is really one of the ancient principles that was prized in antiquity. And I think across time, this concept of dying before dying, dying in this life, in some kind of real sense, in order to achieve a sense of immortality. Let's go down this rabbit hole of history and try and find out the answer to the best kept secret in history, which is not fancy marketing. This is what Huston Smith, perhaps the most influential scholar, religious scholar of the 20th century, referred to this hunt as, which in some ways is a hunt for the Holy Grail. The best kept secret in history, as Huston Smith saw it, were the original sacraments of Western civilization. So I went in hunt of not just any sacrament from ancient Greece or early Christianity, but I went in hunt of psychedelic sacraments specifically. This is not my theory. This is an old idea from at least the 1970s. As you can tell from the ties in this photo, this idea was written about before then. But the way it came across my radar, most people's radar, was in 1978. This scandalous book was published, The Road to Ellucis, Unveiling the Secret of the Mysteries. Now, Ellucis, for those who don't know, is kind of like the spiritual capital of the ancient world, maybe the Vatican of the ancient Greece, about 13 miles northwest of Athens. Pilgrims for 2,000 years would trek to this temple to drink a magic potion and become divine, to confront their fear of death, to overcome that fear of death and become immortal. Hence the same theme about dying before dying. Something happened there in Ellucis, and we're not sure exactly what, but it had to do with achieving divinity. There's a great Greek word for this, apotheosis. And these two gentlemen were well aware of the lore and legends behind Ellucis. And in 1978, they released this scandalous book. On the left is Albert Hofmann, who, if anyone knows about psychedelics, would be Albert. He famously synthesized LSD back in the 1930s from this naturally occurring fungus called ergot. So I'm not sure if people have heard of ergot, but it's this natural fungus that produces all kinds of crazy alkaloids, including LSD. And on his right is his co-author, Gordon Wasson. Now, you might not know who Gordon is, but in 1955, he traveled to Mexico to participate in this ceremony with psilocybin-containing mushrooms. And he's largely responsible for the birth of the pop psychedelic movement in the 1960s. I mean, after Gordon went to Mexico, he was followed by the likes of Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, and Bob Dylan, and everybody else. So that individual is really responsible for what would happen in the generation to come. He teams up not only with Albert, the LSD expert, but with the fellow on the left there, who's a guy named Carl Ruck. He's a professor of classics at Boston University. In the picture there, he's only a couple of years older than me, actually. He's now 85 years old. And he joined up with Gordon and Albert to try and tease out the details for this psychedelic potion at Ellucis. So in the ancient records, we have some sense of what that potion was. We know it was kind of like a primitive beer, like a barley-based potion that was mixed with water and mint. And that's pretty much all we have. And so this figure has spent the past 4 decades, and there he is today, trying to prove that that magical potion from Ellucis, again, the spiritual capital of the ancient world that called to everybody from Plato to Marcus Aurelius for over 2,000 years. Carl has spent his career as a classicist trying to prove that that potion, really at the seat, at the foundation of Western civilization, was a psychedelic potion. And their book is very interesting on, they use literary sources, they look at archaeological sources. The thing is, at the time in the late 1970s, there wasn't a lot of hard data. Since the publication of that book, and relatively recently, over the past 10, 20 years, new sciences have come along, like archaeochemistry, which is, as the name implies, the combination of not just excavation and field work, but actual chemistry, organic chemistry, looking into the contents of some of these ancient chalices. And so for the very first time, we're actually able to peer in to the past by tapping into the residue that was left in some of these chalices and containers and vessels from antiquity. It's a very exciting time. And so I first came across this idea in the late 90s when I was a classicist myself as an undergrad, and I since went to law school and abandoned the whole hunt. But then it all came back on my radar in about 2007 when I started reading about these psychedelic studies, these clinical studies happening at Johns Hopkins and NYU and elsewhere. And the testimony from those people was really strange to me. These people with one and only dose of psilocybin were talking about very mysterious things, very mystical, quasi-religious experiences. You had atheists talking about finding God, for example, with one and only dose of this potent psychedelic. And so it occurred to me that if that's happening today, why wasn't that happening 2,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago? And so I went on a mad hunt for 12 years to try and find the hard scientific data to test this crazy psychedelic hypothesis once and for all, to see if there was some truth to it. So I made my way over to Ellucis, to this ancient spiritual capital a couple of years ago, and I got to talking with the archaeologists, the excavators on site there. And I found myself walking through the ancient temple grounds and meandering into the museum and looking at all these artifacts of whatever was happening here 2,500 years ago, perhaps 3,000 years ago. And inside the museum, you see lots of chalices like this. So, you know, we know this potion was there. We don't know the exact sequence of events, when it was drunk, how it was drunk, but we do know that as many as 3,000 people at one time could cram their way into this temple on site there that was dedicated to Demeter, the goddess of the grain, hence a beer potion, and her daughter Persephone, who's famously abducted into the underworld by the king of death, Hades, and then is resurrected. So there's some intensely ritual element. There's something really meaningful happening here in this death and rebirth experience. It wasn't just about witnessing the death and rebirth of Persephone herself. From the testimony that survived, the initiates themselves went through some kind of visceral experience. Plato himself talks about witnessing the blessed sight and vision that could be captured at Ellucis, again, which begs the question, was this some kind of theatrical performance, something you saw with the physical eyes, or was this something that really happened within the mind's eye? And was there a potion, you know, splashing around these ancient vessels, these ancient chalices, these grails that somehow gave access in some mind-altering state to a higher sense of reality? And I love to look at this artifact in particular because I find it kind of mind-blowing. Carl Kerenyi, who's a very mainstream classicist scholar writing in the 1960s, really harps on this piece specifically, which obviously comes from the classical period. It was found at the sanctuary, and it's referred to as the Ukrate's votive relief. And in Greek, at the bottom there, you see Ukrates on the right. His name is inscribed there, and before it is the word Demeter. And we think, or Carl thinks, that this is actually dedicated to Persephone, whose name shall never be mentioned. So this is already working in coded language. But what Kerenyi says about this artifact is spectacular. He says that what you have here is someone leaving testimony, a votive thanks, a thanksgiving to Demeter and Persephone for restoring his vision. Kerenyi talks about this blind person, this blind initiate, going to Ellucis and somehow having their sight restored. I mean, how can that happen? We're talking about something very supernatural. And yet there are mainstream scholars who've been really trying to figure out what it was about this vision, this beatific vision. In fact, Kerenyi uses that term specifically, and he borrows it from the language of Christianity to describe what was happening at this Ellucis site. And so again, all this circumstantial data kind of points to something. Whether that was a psychedelic brew or not, I spent all these years trying to figure out, and it took me back at least 12,000 years. So what you have here is Göbekli Tepe, which is this archaeological site that was unearthed in the 1990s. And what's fascinating about this, amongst other things, is that it's just not supposed to be there. Göbekli Tepe is thousands of years before Stonehenge, even longer before the high civilizations of antiquity. And yet there's this megalithic, monumental architecture, which Klaus Schmidt, the original archaeologist who's now deceased, talked about the depiction of some kind of gods. And if there was spirituality in prehistory, that this has something to do with that. But what's strange about Göbekli Tepe...
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.